pick up on I think page 7. Let me see. Actually, page 9. So we're starting, it says, in the presence of the Buddhas, all of these bodhisattvas cultivated Brahma conduct, specifically unmoving wisdom Buddha, unobstructed wisdom Buddha, liberation wisdom Buddha, awesome deportment wisdom Buddha, understanding appearances wisdom Buddha, ultimate wisdom Buddha, superior wisdom Buddha, comfortable wisdom Buddha, Brahma wisdom Buddha, and contemplating and investigating wisdom Buddha. At that time, in the presence of all those Buddhas, the voices plural, of Manjushri Bodhisattvas and all those places rang out in unison and as they spoke verses. If someone sees the one of proper awakening as liberated and free from all foes, and has not been attached to all worlds, that person still is not certified to the way I. Don't necessarily like that last translation, so see if we can work on that a bit. How's that?
The eye of sorrow.
Yeah. That's a literal translation. Again, I've changed marks to appearances. It's not ideal, but at least it's, I think, better than just using marks. And then the actual way I here has to do with Dao Yen, and that's literally, Yen is I, correct? Yes? Yeah, and so Dao is a general term, which means the way, the path. So let's just take this one step at a time. What I was suggesting last week was, first of all, that the Brahma conduct here is very interesting. The text says, I'm looking for the first time that Brahma appears. Yeah, so it starts by saying, in the presence of all these Buddhas. One way to interpret this is that while they were cultivating, before their awakening, during their awakening, and probably past their awakening as they embodied this Brahma conduct. And then it says specifically unmoving wisdom. And I think this is referring specifically to these bodhisattvas, not specifically to aspects of Brahma conduct. And they give names of bodhisattvas. Now, for this text, the names of bodhisattvas, if you were ever to take a list, would just be off the charts. I mean, just chapter after chapter after chapter with names and names and names of bodhisattvas. And I was suggesting last week to take these more as qualities of character or qualities of cultivation, rather than literally referring to individuals. Certainly, it is referring to specific bodhisattvas as part of this assembly, but I think also their names are not taken, these are not family names or clan names. These are names that are given or acquired in the process of what they are cultivating or realizing. So in a sense, we can look at the text as sort of when it provides these names, is giving clues of how we might use these qualities to see in a different way that we're seeing, or to listen to things in different ways that we're listening, or even to understand or study and increase and nurture our own light. So in a sense, they're describing sort of the being of awakening, how one bees, how one embodies awakening in a day-to-day way. It's also sort of them pointing to the training and the cultivation required to have this kind of clarity and liberation. So, I mean, we look at a few of them, the idea of unmoving wisdom, and then you have unobstructed wisdom as two of the names, liberation wisdom, just three that we're looking at. And there's two things going on here. I think the use of the word wisdom in this text, and in most of the text, when we look at it, the English word wisdom, I don't think conveys what's going on here. And yet we don't have a better word for it. Why do I say that? If I say wisdom to you, what comes to mind? The word, just the word wisdom. Not much.
A scholarly garret.
Huh?
Is it someone in a scholarly garret reading books?
Okay, a scholar who is reading books.
Knowledgeable.
Huh?
Knowledgeable.
Knowledgeable. Now, usually we make a distinction between knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah.
Knowledge is an accumulation of information, of data, of even literary legacies and so forth.
Like innate experience then?
Like a what?
Innate experience.
Okay, so then it's like an innate experience, but experience of what? We say someone is knowledgeable, it's not the same as saying they're wise. So wise sort of implies, go ahead.
They know what to do.
Huh?
They know what to do in situations.
Okay. Someone who, now we're going from someone who is wise, then acts in a certain way. Like a judge in certain circumstances. Go ahead, you're going to say.
Like insight into the ways of the world.
Okay, so
Understanding.
having insight into the ways of the world, it also implies an overarching perspective. Knowledge gives you details of specifics, but wisdom sort of tells you what to do with that knowledge and how it acts out over time and space. In other words, how it implies how it works. So knowledge, say, without wisdom could be very powerful, but also ill-guided, could end up with considerable amounts of mistakes. So we have knowledge, for example, on biochemistry and so forth, but the knowledge of that doesn't necessarily imply that the use of that could be beneficial or harmful or whatnot. So wisdom implies some perspective that sees beyond just knowledge. It has to do with an application and an implication. One of the texts say it has to do with seeing where paths lead. We're seeing where paths lead. It's a kind of wisdom. But the problem with wisdom, it's abstract and it's a noun. And if I read these texts correctly, I think what's being described here is a way of being rather than a way of thinking, or even a way of, or something you have. Wisdom is something you're doing. It's enacted. Yeah.
I just learned that there is also a term in some Buddhist texts for like faulty prajna.
Faulty prajna.
Bad prajna.
What is bad prajna? Bad wisdom.
Then you have to think, exactly, then you can't really use the word wisdom, you have to think maybe more like discernment or something, which can be...
Sort of which? Go ahead.
I said then you have to go with something more like discernment, that can go right or wrong in a way.
Right.
I think wisdom has aspect of ethics, maybe, and I think it's T.S. Eliot.
And what? I heard it has aspects of ethics and...
Aspect of ethics, ethical.
Yes.
T.S. Eliot said something like information, you have information, then you have knowledge, then you have wisdom. So it's like that. It goes higher. So fortune cookie said, something like smart person knows what to say, a wise person knows what not to say. So wisdom to me is I take this from the fortune cookie.
The wise cookie.
Just looking at the text, unmoving wisdom Buddha implies knowing when to act and when not to act. Unmoving could mean having the understanding when to do something and when not to do it as well.
Right. It has everything, and this is why I'm saying the one word wisdom doesn't convey with, all that you're trying to get at here. It's a functioning. It's an applied way of acting, of talking, of being. It's not simply a sort of something you have, but it's something you enact and something you're constantly discerning with. It's not fixed. It requires a nimbleness of being able to see in every situation what's most appropriate, what's ethically sound, and most effective for beneficial outcome, which may not be self-benefit at all. It may be a larger analysis. This thing, it talks about unmoving means the still and unmoving aspect here in Buddhism doesn't refer to a sort of passive withdrawal into a kind of meditative trance, still and unmoving, but it talks about an ability to be centered in the midst of things. It's an unfazed centering. It's an engaged way of being still and unmoving, yet within the flux, the flow of things. One of the commentaries says, all of us are complete with the same unmoving wisdom as unmoving wisdom Buddha, but we've forgotten it. So it's kind of a pointing away from the bodhisattva having this is something innate in us. It's as if we were in a dream, and therefore not activating that inherent wisdom. There's a wonderful passage later in the Avatamsaka that describes this. Wisdom everywhere examines. So it's very active, it's very observant. It's 360 degrees. Wisdom everywhere examines, yet is forever still. So this has this, it's almost a contradiction of terms, but it's pointing to something that it's a stillness that comes from purity and clarity of mind and no outflows, seeking nothing, completely within the being of your own nature. When you're there, when you're centered in that way, you can forever examine, yet you're forever still. So it's reflective rather than a projecting energy. This, I think, also comes close to what the Sixth Patriarch talks about. If we go back to your point that you say ethics was at the core of this, this is, in fact, part of a threefold model, where the beginning is ethics, or Shila, which really, what that's all about is just giving you a ground. It gives you some room to breathe in your habitual energies, to pull back and not be completely caught up in the flow of impulse and reactive behavior. With that breathing room, you can then examine, you can look at things and get to a place where basically, again, the Sixth Patriarch calls it, you can let the mind remain unattached, clinging to nothing. So the samadhi that comes off the Shila is a state of equanimity. It's a state of balanced centering that you are in the midst of things, but you let your mind be in its more natural state of unattached, clinging to nothing. That then leads to the third thing, which is prajna, or wisdom. So it's Shila, Samadhi, Prajna. And basically wisdom is just the application of the mind that is clinging to nothing. So again, Hui Nung describes this, that the mind is everywhere engaged, but nowhere attached. So again, it's this movement and stillness thing, but that's what wisdom is. And so to say wisdom sounds to me sort of like a possessed thing I have. It's like my library. I got wisdom. But it's not something you have. It's something you're constantly working with, coming out of Shila, coming out of equanimity and balance, and then engaging, nowhere clinging, nowhere attached. So you really have to be at a place here where thought after thought, movement to movement, you're unencumbered. You're not clinging, you're not seeking. And I think that's what the unobstructed wisdom has to do too. We get stuck. Okay, so I'm going to use stuck and unstuck. Unobstructed means not stuck. But it's the nature of basically, the text describe unawakened, unwise living beings. What defines them is they get stuck or they stick. They actually grab and try to hold on to what cannot be held on to. And this almost impulsive, habitual wanting, craving, grasping, grasping, is how we get stuck. The irony is we can't get what we're seeking because it's all conditioned dharmas are like dreams, illusion, bubbles, shadows. So yes, you can go out and gather all the bubbles you want. But as soon as you grab the bubbles, right, they're gone. And yet that doesn't stop the impulse of wanting, grasping. And this is the, I guess, part of avidya, the foolishness, the ignorance, that even though we know that's true, we can't subdue ourselves from this process. And that's what cultivation really comes down to, is working with those habitual instincts, I'm going to say habituated instincts, that are constantly grasping. So, for example, I'll just read you again, because we just went through this text before. Hui Nang describes this as paramita. He describes this wisdoming, ing, I'm sorry, I just did a neologism here, but wisdoming as, in fact, they should just have the Nike thing under wisdom. Just do it. He says, what does this mean? Basically, it means arriving at the other shore. It means that one is no longer bound by birth and death. If one clings to the sensory realm, birth and death arise, like waves arise in the water. This is called this shore. Now, what he's talking about is this grasping, attaching, clinging. That's this shore. That's the illusory condition. If you do not cling to sensory states, there is no birth and death, just like freely flowing water. So again, he's describing this, the unobstructed, or here the still, is yet like freely flowing water. This is what's meant by the other shore. If you can cultivate a mind that does not cling to anything inside or outside and comes and goes freely, such a mind can get rid of all grasping, unhindered understanding that arises naturally. So this is Huineng taking the idea of wisdom and translating into a functioning, dynamic, activating, discerning, balancing state that's on 24/7, or we're not working with it. But it doesn't leave. The capacity doesn't leave. It's just a question of how we function and use it. So that's why I think the unobstructed, or this one, the unmoving wisdom, has to be unpacked a little bit. Otherwise, we take it as something that we get, that we settle, we attach to, we have. But it really doesn't come into play except through activity. I don't know if that helps. So in a sense, what a teacher is always looking for is, what did you do in that situation? What did you say in that situation? What are you doing with your mind right now? Then that shows whether or not you are using this inherent wisdom or you're not using it. If you use it, you, quote, have it for the moment that you're using it. And as soon as you stop using it, you don't have it for the moment that you're not using it. So it comes and goes, manifest or not manifest. I wouldn't say comes or goes, but it manifests or seemingly seems to be gone in the very use and action of it. Without use and action, there's no actual operation of wisdom. I don't know if this makes sense. So I can never remember in all my experiences with my teacher, he ever said, so-and-so has or doesn't have wisdom. That was never used. What was used was, what did you do? And what you did then indicated the operation of that capacity. So if you see it as a capacity that either is used faulty or it's used clearly, but it's not something you have that's unchanging and forever. I've got wisdom now. Okay? All right. He goes on, this is Hui Neng again, he gives a description of how it functions, and this will get into this next passage when we deal with outflows. He says, just let your original mind, your true mind, let it remain pure. Let it remain in its undisturbed, ungrasping state, so that the six consciousness go out the six sensory gates, yet remain undefiled and do not intermix with the six dust, the sensory objects. Coming and going freely, penetrating without obstruction. This is prajna samadhi, wisdom samadhi, freedom and liberation. This is the practice of no thought. So now he calls it no thought because it is an activity where you're thinking but not clinging or grasping or holding on to thoughts. There's a mental awareness and alertness going on. It's thinking, but it's not thinking in the sense of hanging on and clinging to your thoughts. But it's rather responsive intellect, a responsive alert mind. And what he describes here is that the six consciousness of mind, let's say your mind, with your six sense organs, is able to go freely into the world of sights and sounds, and it intermixes without getting stuck, without penetrating. It's there, it's observing, it's moving, yet it's forever still, that kind of sense. This describes a kind of dynamic equilibrium rather than a static position. And so it wouldn't necessarily even, maybe truly, cautiously use this, show up while you're meditating. Unless you define meditation in the way the patriarch does, which is 24/7, walking, standing, sitting, even in your sleep, you are thus alert, clear. But if you think wisdom manifests when I'm sitting, it would be very easy to fall into a self-deception on that one. Because it really doesn't manifest until you can show a nimbleness and unattached in the midst of the 10,000 things while they're all around, while they're working. This is a little tricky. Meditation can be like a workout in a gym practice to get a feel for what that is while you're just dealing with the states of your own consciousness. But as you move out into interrelationships, interactions, and so forth, then wisdom either shows or not shows. So no matter what state we had in our meditation, we could sit for 2 hours, 3 hours, almost go into zona, zombie nirvanas. The master, the teacher, would never praise that. He would praise what happened when you uncrossed your legs and how you reacted in X, Y, Z situation. And sometimes he wouldn't even praise that. He would just say, so you're acting naturally. You didn't get moved. But if you got moved, he would say, no matter how long you meditate, it still shows you haven't been able to use your wisdom. And in fact, your wisdom, your meditation is obstructing your wisdom because you're attaching to your meditation as a remove from the world. That's why Hui Neng says looking for Bodhi outside the world is like looking for a rabbit with horns. Okay. I should have finished Hui Neng's last thing. I forgot. So, if you do not think anything at all, I'm wise, I'm unmoving, I'm still, I'm pure, I don't think anything at all. In order to repress and eradicate thought, this is called Dharma bondage. So now you've tied yourself up not with sensory objects, but with Dharma. So there's 100 ways you can tie yourself up, and you think, well, I never thought I'd tie myself up with Dharma, but you can. This is very interesting, Dharma bondage. In other words, it's a kind of application of a faulty wisdom. If you say wisdom is a state of remove from the world, it's an unmoving, still absorption, trance-like state, and I call this prajna, he actually calls that Dharma bondage. Because what you're doing is repressing rather than flowing with in the midst of things. And repression works for a while. Even Freud knew this, but over time it returns. And this is what the return of the repressed is somewhat about. Anyhow, you're looking, you know the return of the repressed? Oh. Anybody want to explain? I don't want to bring Freud too much into this, but Freud had a basic theory that if you have certain tendencies arising and you don't deal with them, you instead repress them and push them down and try to remove them from consciousness, they will return in kind of, how shall we say, unwholesome or what he would call neurotic states of being. So in his system, repression only leads to a holding back temporarily only to have it resurface and rebuild and come back to haunt you. And sometimes in indirect ways, sometimes physically. You might get certain illnesses or habits coming because you've repressed certain things. So repression doesn't work even in a Freudian system, much less in the Buddhist model. Does that help? So the Buddha would never say repress your desires. He'd say transform them, see through them, let go, but not repress them. Because anything repressed actually is getting a longer lease on life. And will come back to haunt you. Okay. We talked about Brahma conduct last week, correct? Basically what it meant. Everybody okay with Brahma conduct? Huh?
You mentioned that you will say more about Brahma conduct.
Brahma conduct? Okay. At the very least, sometimes it refers to brahmacharya, Brahma conduct. For monastics, it's basically talking about celibacy. But it goes beyond that, and we mentioned that it had to do with other expressions, but have to do with this, actually, the unattached, unbound, liberated state that isn't in any way seeking or craving or wanting anything. So that freedom from that is the innate, quote, purity, which is to be whole and complete in oneself, and knowing one is whole and complete. So it's not a purity you cultivate necessarily, it's a purity that manifests when you just let the mind be, the emotions be unattached, clinging to nothing. So again, Huineng is clear about, the text also talks about this, the purity is something that's innate and whole, and recognizing that wholeness. So then, some of the key ingredients of the Brahma conduct then turn into what the Brahma Viharas, which is loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. These are manifestations of that. Then it gets into when that arises and becomes natural, it no longer has to be done even necessarily supported by precepts, because precepts are associated with Brahma conduct. It's a kind of restraint, a kind of disciplining the body, mouth, and mind. When the flavor of Brahma conduct, Brahma behavior starts to take hold, it reinforces itself. And the precepts then actually hold themselves. So you use the precepts to get started on this, but once the reinforcement comes from the experience of the joy of Brahma conduct, Brahma life, the whole complete, liberated, unseeking, unwanting, there's a kind of, it goes from basically an uninterestedness to all the things that attract an outflow. They don't, it's not like you have to say no, no, 1,000 times no. It's like your position now is to actually see it for what it is, and you're not interested quite naturally. It's gone from sort of a disenchantment to a disinterest to an unfazed to a so what. This is not something you can, quote, cultivate. You can't get there except by seeing through it and putting it down. But I want to express something here. When you see through it and let go of it, it's not experienced as a loss or renunciation as it starts to become whole inside you. It's experienced really as a fullness and a liberation. It's almost an ironic, unexpected thing that happens. And I say this because if it were simply seeing through it and putting down, that would be repression again. And repression, again, returns as kinky desires. It doesn't go away, it comes back. So it's only by really seeing through it and letting go, and then having the corresponding joy, liberation, and fullness that necessarily and naturally arises from that this thing works. It is not a renunciate practice, but rather a kind of exciting, attractive, almost, and I'm using it in a positive way, of I naturally want, it's sort of like on a sunny day, you naturally want to go out and enjoy. Today was a nice day. People naturally were looking out the windows, naturally going to their gardens, naturally going out. This is what Brahma conduct starts to feel like after a while. It's just sort of natural that you want to do that. It's not like, oh, it's a nice day, I must go out. I should go out today and enjoy. No, it doesn't have that. Anyway, I want to. This is really important because if you talk about it as it's actually experienced, as opposed to you imagine it before you actually have the experience, it turns into a kind of self-fighting and self-negation and a kind of bitterness. But these things reward immediately in the enactment of them. Okay, that's what I say a little bit about the Brahma conduct thing. Now if we look at this verse, and it's really a kind of confusing verse, and I'll just deal with one aspect of it tonight, which has to do with the second line. If someone sees the one of proper enlightenment, who's the one of proper enlightenment? Huh? Zheng Jue, proper enlightened one.
Wouldn't that be a Buddha?
A Buddha, probably. A Bodhisattva. If you see that one of enlightenment as liberated and free from all outflows, if you see them as this, and not being attached to all worlds, that person who sees in that way still has not certified to the Daoyan, the anybody want to render the way I into something here? Give it a shot. I mean, certifying to the way I really isn't even Chinglish. It's worse than Chinglish. I'm sorry. And to certify to a way I?
About awakened vision.
Awakened vision, but you still haven't counted for Tao.
Or the way of being?
Right.
The way of being, perhaps?
Well, it's talking about if someone sees, then we go back to this. So they're not seen through wisdom. They're not seeing it. They're seeing it through a glass darkly. They're seeing it obscured. They're seeing it through a cataract. But to see through wisdom is an unobstructed, total clear.
Maybe right view.
Right view.
Clear vision?
Clear vision. It sounds, clear vision. I mean, it sounds like an ophthalmologist dream, but Do you see how difficult translation is? I mean, to certify to the way I.
Look, does someone who understands the Chinese can just explain it in a few sentences and not in perfect words?
Okay.
I don't know what it's supposed to be.
What is it? Let's not look at the word specifically. What's the meaning here?
I feel the I is not translated as I, it's more like a keyhole.
More like a
Keyhole. The hole of the key.
Keyhole. Yen is keyhole?
It could be a hole, it could be eye,
Uh-huh.
or discernment,
Huh?
discernment.
Discernment is not discerning or lacks discernment?
Someone who has the discernment for I hate to use this word, the proper way, like someone who actually can see and recognize proper enlightenment versus improper enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the next sentence is, if someone knows the less come one, if this I is related to the knowing or ability to see and recognize or have insight of. And I think here is more, if somebody still sees the Buddha as a form, then that person, the Buddha you are seeing is not the real Buddha. Kind of a thought, Dhamma Sutra.
Well, is it so much that the one you're seeing is not the real Buddha, or you're seeing is not real seeing? Yeah, it could mean that if you see someone like that, that's actually not a real Buddha. That could be one of the meanings here.
It's what you project as the Buddha is not the.
Or what you think a Buddha is. So you're not seeing it through a true eye. And I think true has to be, or trued eye. Dao means as things as they really are. So the use of the word Dao here has to do with you are seeing things as they really are. And so you're not seeing things truly, kind of what the Tao vision would mean here.
Does that mean,
Go ahead.
does that mean that someone who is unawakened is incapable of recognizing awakening in someone else?
It could be that because you look at somebody who's liberated from outflows and you think that's a Buddha, then your understanding and your way of looking at things is not complete and whole. You're a little bit early here. That's where I think this is kind of going. Is that where you were getting at?
Yeah, I think so. It's it's a frustrating notion. For me, anyways. I mean, like, yeah, you won't know it if you think you see it, you're not seeing it. And so where does that leave you? Is kind of my next question.
The next question would be, what would it mean to see through the way? To see through it, to see things through the way. Then, if that's not, what would it mean if you did see from the way? One of the expressions is he or she is a person of the way, a person who has realized the way with no mind. This is the expression. They realize they're a person of the way with no mind. Wu Xin, Wu Xiang. So what it means is if they are a person of the way, they are so aligned with things as they really are, both descriptively and then prescriptively in their own behavior, they're aligned. They see things clearly, immediately, not mediated by thought, projections, even appearances. So this is sort of leaning in the direction of saying, if you have the vision that comes with realizing the way, you would not mistake someone free from outflows as being a thus come one, a Buddha. Now this gets it a little tricky, because to be free of outflows is in fact one of the sought after, I think the most important sought after dimension of self-cultivation. It's called anashrava, without outflows, free of outflows. And that is, by definition, when the outflows cease, that ceasing is awakening. And it's very concrete. It's not like I have wisdom or not. You no longer have greed, anger, delusion, desire, jealousy, envy. Your thoughts are no longer kind of half on, half off, so forth. You are really aligned. You're really clearly aligned with the way. That's why you're called a person of the way. You and the way are not two. And so there's no mediated, there's no quote thinking, there's no speculating going on here. So then it indicates somehow that although freedom from outflows is, and it's one of the terms that's used to describe an arhat. An arhat is someone who is free from outflows. And so is a Buddha free from outflows.
Marty,
And yet, something's wrong here.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not sure I understand these 4 lines. I think I may have a misunderstanding, but your idea that this is a projection of the person who is seeing. The first line, if someone sees the one of proper enlightenment and so on, and then the last line says that person still has not certified to the way I. That person is the one doing the seeing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is the projecting or the, it's really kind of a misapplication. A person who doesn't have the outflows shouldn't be projecting anything onto the person who they are seeing that doesn't have the outflows. Does that make any sense?
I think the first 2 lines are the key, which you're going back to. When you say, if someone sees
Right.
a proper enlightened person as liberated, if you see them as that way, you're not seeing correctly.
Exactly.
Everybody's, is that right?
No.
So there's something wrong with the way they may be free of outflows, and they may be a one of proper enlightenment, but you're seeing them in that way as missing something. That's what's being suggested here. It's very subtle. There's a similar passage from the Vajra Sutra. It's very interesting. The Vajra Sutra, I think Heng Sure has been lecturing that.
Yes, on Friday.
So the Vajra Sutra, when the Buddha, the Tathagata says, if one looks for the Tathagata in sights and sounds, appearances, one walks a crooked path and will never see the Tathagata. The Tathagata cannot be seen in sights nor heard in sounds. In other words, whatever that is, it is not marked by something you see or hear. And in fact, if you look for that, you're looking on the surface. So this was part of the character in this sutra. Subhuti had this moment where the text begins where he has this profound moment where he sees the Buddha has been in the state of full awakening, right while in the midst of doing his daily things of walking on alms rounds, washing his bowl, and so on and so forth. And it's inexpressible to him how he missed it. But it wasn't in the sights and sounds, and he was still looking for something. So that's where the Buddha comes back and says, if you look for me in sights and sounds, you walk a crooked path, you'll never see, you'll never behold, encounter the thus come one. So there's something going on here that's really quite... Anybody want to do a further take on that?
I was wondering if it has something to do with the outward expression of being liberated and free from all outflows is actually, I'm not saying that right. Is it that if somebody has reached proper enlightenment, then they would not, then they would actually be engaged in the world in a way that would appear to everyone else who is not enlightened as if they're just engaging with the world, and yet they would not see that beneath that there is a lack of outflows, and there is. Am I making any sense?
Well, you can see, when we sit down to translate this, your translation is going to be only as good as the understanding you're able to bring. And all translation is interpretation. So the interpretation of this is critical to the whole rendering of this. And I was just looking for some of the commentary. I don't want to leave it hanging completely tonight. Here, let me read a commentary, see if that helps us. I mean, it's fun to wrestle with this. Yes, you want to wrestle some more?
I was thinking about something. It's come from Zheng Dao Ge. In Chinese it says, 密集之君不可见，不离当处常战。
Translate.
Translate is, if you want seeking friends, you want seeking something, you cannot see it. It's just right here at this moment. I think this maybe someone can help me translate this. Is a 密集之君不可见. You're seeking, you're looking for something. You cannot see it. And it's right here, right this moment. It never leaves you. It stays with you all the time. So, when you see something, you want searching, you want to find a way. But you couldn't find it. It's right here. It's right there. Even, yeah, you have this, you have this experience, this no offload. You have this stillness. You have this right vision, right idea. But if you really want to speak out, or you want to say, okay, I found a way, it's not there.
Is it the seeking? Is that there is no?
There's
no seeing without seeking.
It's just right there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is not what I said. It's just from Zheng Dao Ge, the one sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
This is very hard. It seems when we render it this way that we're playing with words or it's mystical, when in fact the words themselves can only hint at something that when it's realized is not that. And so it's really almost like the text is saying you can't put this into words. You see there's two here. It's one without outflows and the other was not attached to all worlds. So if you see one of proper enlightenment as these having these two things, they're not attached to all worlds and they're also free of outflows, you're still not at... So the commentary on this says, and this is very interesting, I don't know if this is going to clarify it or not, but it's really interesting. The one of proper enlightenment isn't attached and isn't not attached. And then the quote is, he or she sweeps away all dharmas and leaves all appearances behind. The path on words and language is cut off, and the workings of the mad mind are stopped. One leaves all appearances, and this is inconceivable, but not inexperienceable. And the Avatamsaka says this can be experienced but not expressed. It can be known but not explained. If you say something has left something, then you have set up a distinction between that which is left and that which is not left. So it's not ultimate. If you say there's an attachment and a non-attachment, you're still talking about opposing dharmas. That's why the last line of the verse says that person still has not certified to the way I. If you see it in this way, then you've not certified to the ultimate, which is the I that sees the way, the Tao. If you haven't certified to, quote, the way I, then you don't have true and actual wisdom. So it's basically playing with this thing of if you see there's attachment, non-attachment, if you see there's flow and outflow, and you're doing this marking, measuring, you're still not in the ultimate. You're still in a kind of dual framework. There's this wonderful passage from the Avatamsaka, later we'll get to it. I'll maybe close on this one tonight. The Bodhisattvas come to the Buddha and say, they're having some discussion, and basically says, the world Anand has taught us to sunder and break all our attachments and leave them behind. And the Buddha said, I didn't teach you that. Whoa! And the one who has the way I says, see, I told you. And the other one that said, oh, wait a minute, I thought you said just break our attachments. And the Buddha said, how can you break something that doesn't exist? There are no attachments that you can actually make, so how could you let go of them? This is getting at the flavor of this verse here, is that fundamentally there's not one thing, there's no problem whatsoever. But if you say there's attachment and non-attachment, and there's outflow and there's not outflow, you're back into that dualistic structuring. So by saying, I say expediently to you, you should break all attachments, when in fact, you cannot form any attachments in the first place. So this language is really just... But behind that is a profoundly liberating visionary, to say everything's okay, no problem, right at the fundamental root. Oh, now you have attachments? Well, we talk about breaking them, but in fact, how could you form them in the first place? Because there's nothing you can attach to. And if you understood that deeply in your being, then you wouldn't be... Because you're not really forming an attachment. You cannot form an attachment. You can pretend, you can think, you can hope, and you can tie yourself up into this. But the actual getting attached, it ain't possible. Sorry. So you cannot get what you want. Okay.
It also reminds me of
You can get what you need.
in the sixth patriarch. The sixth patriarch was talking about. I seem to remember talking about techniques almost to keep people from setting up. So it's just finding out where you're setting up, finding out where you're attaching. In this case, attaching around the idea of what it is to be enlightened, and then puncturing that, or pushing on it, or, taking the support out from underneath it so that they can't set up anymore. But the truth isn't actually to be found. The way isn't actually to be found in what is being said. It's what is being undone.
That's right. So this is really, we're moving along a trajectory here where the Buddha upon his awakening and the sixth patriarch upon his awakening say, wow, how unexpected. Everything is whole and complete. The 10,000 things come from this working of my own mind. There is nothing to get and nothing to obtain. I only mistakenly don't see that it's there whole and complete, and then I go out and get lost, and dharmas are then created to reestablish, return me to what I already had whole and complete at the beginning, so you're in a full circle here. So the dharma is not something you get, it's merely a corrective to restoring what you already have but don't know. This is very, very tricky, but it's very profoundly, I think, positive in the sense that the only reason for having any dharma, any cultivation, is really a expedient device that's created because we forget in our original pure true nature. But there's nothing to get. The dharma doesn't deliver it. So I think in going to this, it's saying whoever that one of proper enlightenment is, isn't into outflow, non-outflow, isn't into attachment and non-attachment. Both of those arrive when you move off that ground to begin with. So that's why he says to, remember Hui Ming, he says, before your mind of win and lose, before your mind of good and bad arises, what is your original face? And he's going back and he's saying the win or lose, right or wrong, good or bad, is the movement off that ground already. But on that ground, whole and complete, there's nothing there. Everything is just thus. This is the word they use. Anyhow, that's pretty heavy tonight, I think, to think about. Next week, I want to, though, spend some time on this really important concept, outflows, and go into it some way. Because although the verse says, if you see one, you see the dust come on, that doesn't mean that an awakened person has outflows. And so psychologically, emotionally, this is a really important concept. So next Friday, we'll unpack that a little bit and look at it and bring some commentary to it as well. So any questions, comments, closing remarks? Announcement, yes?
Will there be a retreat for reciting Avatamsaka Sutra and SCP this year?
That's a good question. Is there an Avatamsaka recitation retreat?
Not this year.
Huh. That's one of the practices that people engage in. They actually enter into a 3 non-outflow study practice by using recitation. So the same, all cultivation has those 3 elements. It has the crown that gives you some breathing room called Shila. It allows you to pull back from unwholesome karma. And in that space, then you can bring your mind to attentive awareness and basically disengage it from outflowing. And while you're in, one of the methods you can use is recitation. So you can actually use a text recitation as a device for samadhi. And this samadhi I'm talking about is not a removal trance state, but rather a ongoing moment-to-moment equanimity, so that by focusing on the text, you are bringing your mind to a single point. By bringing your mind to a single point, you trick it into not attaching, not going out. And the result is a liberating feeling. Also, the reason why you would use a text like this is because the imagery and language of the text also has a very profound effect on the psyche in terms of cleansing, in terms of reorientation. It's really quite remarkable. So it's a good point you bring up. Heng Sure began his practice by bowing to every character of the Avatamsaka, just using bowing plus recitation, but one character at a time. So that's really unplugging and going slow at it. But this is one of the ways that you can use sutra recitation to cultivate 3 non-outflow practice. It's pretty cool. Also, memorization's another way that you can use to practice this. But I must say, the translation has to be inspiring to memorize it in English. So if you're memorizing Chinese, it's got the cadence, the rhythm, it's really cool. You know, Dao Yan and then Wei, Mind I, Wei I. Nah. So we got to get, I think, maybe a little better English translations before we're inspired to memorize them. Okay, any announcements?
So tomorrow our schedule will be slightly different because in Auckland Museum we have 19 lunar New Year celebration. 2 days of celebrating Lunar New Year, and some of people of our community are engaged in this event. It will be the booth with the books, and you can train your skills in calligraphy if you want. And I think it will be some. They're thinking to create opportunity to learn how to make the spring rolls, and it will be dragon dancing show and other interesting things. If they're interesting for you, you can come and check out from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. Saturday and Sunday. And tomorrow we'll still have Dharma assembly in the morning.
It's at Oakland Museum.
Auckland Museum at
Not
Auckland.
here.
No.
What's that?
The location is in
Auckland Museum. Auckland Museum.
Not at the monastery.
No.
So the spring roll, the calligraphy is all at the Oakland Museum, not here. Okay.
Yeah, but here we'll have in the morning a Dharma assembly. So you can come and probably do you know? Universal Door Chapter. Pumen Pin will be here. You can recite Guanyin name, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva name is the part of this ceremony, and meditation every day. No lunch, right? No lunch.
So you got.
We are fasting. No, this is just.
So let me understand. You go to the Oakland Museum, you get spring rolls and dragon dancing and calligraphy. And if you come here, there's no lunch, there's no spring rolls, there's no dancing.
Just cultivating.
What time is this?
Which one?
So yeah, 9 a.m. here, like every Saturday.
Every Saturday you do that?
Right.
Oh.
Sometimes. And great compassion repentance.
At
9 a.m.
night.
in the
Oh,
morning.
with lunch. Every
Right.
Saturday you have lunch. But tomorrow no lunch.
Sorry, Oakland.
In Auckland, tomorrow will be food. In the monastery, we are not no food at 11 a.m. We don't have normal open lunch tomorrow because of this activity in the museum. So we can come in the morning for practice, 9 a.m., or for meditation, 6:15.
So tomorrow is Universal Door. Next Saturday is the Great Compassion.
Right, repentance. Yes.
Is it true that the Saturday evening ceremony is open?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so I could just come.
You just
not
come
worry
and
about
join. Yeah.
Bring your own spring rolls.
You're welcome. Tomorrow will be in English when we recite Avamtasaka Sutra in English at 6:30 p.m. So this is another event. What will gonna happen tomorrow is evening ceremony, 5 p.m. meditation. So meditation we have twice a day, every day, 7 days a week. And tomorrow we have a lecture. Rev. Heng Sure will give us online lecture about Avatamsaka Sutra as well. 7:30 p.m.
I would make a plug here for, on Friday night, we do some meditation before to get our minds calm in a traditional way and look into this text. And we're looking at it analytically and through translation and so forth. But don't overlook the cultivation of things like the recitation of the text tomorrow morning, and also equally the Great Compassion Repentance Ceremony. These are powerful, equal doors of understanding, both ourselves and the world, that are not necessarily obvious to someone who's just beginning. If you're intellectual, if you're educated, you tend to primarily choose the analytical, discursive intellect as your door of understanding. But realize that these devotional doors, and especially something like the Great Compassion Repentance, works at another level. It's working on the mind in a deep way. When we work analytically, we're only working with one dimension. It's a limited tool of inquiry, this intellect. It doesn't say it's not to be used, but it's not full and complete. When you work on these others, what you're doing is you're working on the full capacity of the mind and the heart simultaneously. And it's in that conjunction, working on that things happen. You begin to see things that you don't necessarily get just through intellectual analysis. And I'm not trying to pose them as opposites. I'm saying they're complementary pairs. So don't think that these are not related to what we're doing on our Friday night. In fact, it's almost like these are the sort of prerequisites for getting past passages of text like we're working on tonight, where the intellect, and it says the path of words and language is cut off, there's another path that opens up at that point. It's not like an either or. You push it to that extreme, and then the actual understanding of that passage comes through a moment that's engaged with a single-minded practice, and suddenly you can see something you didn't see before. So I'm saying allow yourself to immerse completely in the range of these practices, because they work on different elements of the psyche of the mind, and don't limit it only to an analytical intellectual. Anyhow, I want to say that because for me, when I first came in, it was actually bowing repentances that it started to melt the ice of my habitual formations and mind. And when my mind reached a point where it couldn't go any further, it was the actual bowing practice that started to open portals of knowing that would not come just through words and language and philosophical analysis. And if that hadn't been available at the monastery, and I just plugged into a kind of philosophical program of study, I wouldn't have had the near complete experience that this can offer. So, dive in while you got it available and try it out.
And sometimes we can use the sound as a just meditation focus, even without go to the meaning. Even it's Chinese, and it's sometimes very liberating. So it could be another type of meditation, and in different ways. We can bow, we can walk, be very relaxed. Kind of sometimes the sound produce kind of wholesome emotions, like Marty mentioned about Brahma viharas. So the viharas is the place of monastery, but it's more emotional tone in our heart, can open up, uplift, and create a space when we can let go much more skillfully. you can try out. Tomorrow 9 a.m.
So there's said to be 84,000 afflictions and 84,000 Dharma doors to counter them. So if you say, oh, we got 1,000, then do 1,000 Dharma doors. Okay, we'll do the transference in English. Our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of hate turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise.
Bowing respect to the triple jewels.